Welcome back to Piers Uncensored live from New York City. I'm joined now by Ambassador Mark Regev, the senior advisor to Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu and former ambassador to the United Kingdom. He joins me live from Tel Aviv. Mr. Regev, thank you very much indeed for joining me. I wanted to start by reading what Barack Obama, the former US president, has come out and said in a statement. He said, Israel has a right to defend its citizens against such wanton violence. But even as we support Israel, we should also be clear that how Israel prosecutes this fight against Hamas matters, and it must abide by international law. He says the world is watching, and any Israeli military strategy that ignores the human costs could ultimately backfire. Already thousands of Palestinians have been killed in the bombing of Gaza, many of them children, hundreds of thousands forced from their homes. The Israeli government's decision to cut off food, water and electricity to a captive civilian population threatens not only to worsen a growing humanitarian crisis, it could further harden Palestinian attitudes for generations, erode global support for Israel, play into the hands of Israel's enemies and undermine long-term efforts to achieve peace and stability in the region. What's your response to that?
So there's a dilemma here. On one hand, we want to hit Hamas and destroy its military machine and end its political rule over Gaza. And at the same time, of course, we don't want to see the civilian population of Gaza suffer unnecessarily. In many ways, they too are victims of Hamas's oppressive rule. So we've got to try to balance those two. And what we're trying to do, and you can be the judge if we're succeeding or not, is we're trying to hit Hamas hard, ultimately to destroy Hamas. And at the same time, offer as best we can solutions to the civilian population of Gaza, who are not the targets of our operation.
I guess what critics would say is that 5,000 to 6,000 civilians in Gaza have already been killed, which is 4 times as many as died in the appalling terror attacks of October the 7th. And that if there's a ground invasion, that number will exponentially rise to perhaps hundreds of thousands of innocent Palestinian civilians. And they would question whether that is proportionate. And also they would say, well, it's fine to say to Palestinian people, you've got to get out of northern Gaza. But if all their homes are getting leveled in the process, where do they go back to? Where do these people live at the end of this? What happens to them?
So let's discuss what you've raised. Number one, when this is over, I'm sure there'll be a massive reconstruction effort inside the Gaza Strip to build homes that have been destroyed. And I think there'll be international support for that. But we have to destroy Hamas. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you, Piers, that there won't be civilian casualties, to make a promise. Yes, there won't be. But that would be illogical. You've covered wars. You know there hasn't been a war in modern history where there haven't been civilians caught up in the crossfire. But what we can do as a democratic country is make a maximum effort to keep those casualties as low as is humanly possible. Now, you're right when you say to me that asking civilians to move from the north to the south, that's not easy. A lot of people, it's very difficult for them to move. I understand that. It can be very threatening to ask people to move. They don't like moving. But surely that is, in the real world, that is preferable to a situation where they're caught up in the crossfire and possibly be casualties. And they have moved in their masses. Hundreds of thousands of people have moved from the north to the south. And now our challenge, and we're working with the international community on this, is to see what humanitarian facilities we can build in the south for those internally displaced people. And we're partners in that.
One of the major issues you're going to have, and we just discussed this with General David Petraeus, who knows better than most what happened in both Iraq and Afghanistan in response to 9/11, is that you've got to win hearts and minds of the Palestinian people, or ultimately you'll just create more problems going forward than you even have now. How do you win hearts and minds if thousands of these civilians are dying on a daily basis? That surely will have the opposite effect. And like I say, these numbers are likely to dramatically increase. And world opinion, you know already, is turning against Israel, which seems extraordinary so soon after the scale of those terror attacks. But you know that it is. And there has been some very disturbing anti-Semitism that we've seen around the world. Does it not concern you that the strategy that Israel is currently adopting, coupled with a potential ground invasion imminently, may actually have the opposite effect to what you hope for, that you get rid of Hamas, perhaps, but in the process you create something far worse.
So first of all, people are describing Hamas, and not Israelis. International leaders have described Hamas as worse than ISIS. And when the German chancellor was here last week, he said they're like the Nazis. And so you ask what is worse than Hamas. I'm not sure there is a lot worse than Hamas, though maybe we'll be surprised. Yes, but I'm not sure that's pretty low, Hamas, and I'm not sure you can get a lot worse. But can I raise one issue that needs to be said? All the numbers coming out of Gaza about civilian casualties, they're all provided by the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health. Now, as you know, better than many, that Hamas doesn't have a democratic rule. There's no civil society, independent civil society in Gaza. It's an authoritarian regime. And if you would believe the numbers coming out of Hamas, I mean, we're only killing innocent civilians. Well, obviously that's not true. They don't even record a single Hamas fighter who has been killed. And now that's clearly impossible. I don't deny there have been innocents caught up in the conflict. But the numbers that are coming out, that are announced every day by the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, that's clearly propaganda. I mean, once again, have you heard a single announcement about combat fatalities on their side, or what I'd call terrorists that we've killed? Not one.
Well, I think, well, in a way, you've highlighted one of the big problems you're going to face going forward with a ground invasion. How do you tell somebody who's a combatant from a civilian? It's going to be incredibly difficult. You know, General Petraeus again was talking about that. Let me ask you: you're an advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu. Many Israelis, I mean, the polling currently suggests that the majority of Israelis are absolutely furious at what they see as him dropping the ball in terms of security and intelligence, enabling Hamas to commit this outrage. Many think he should have resigned, but he hasn't even apologized publicly for those failings on October the 7th. Why not?
Well, first of all, Israelis are entitled to be angry. I mean, the Hamas, a brutal enemy, caught us unexpected, surprised. And there's a whole series of failures. I mean, you talk about at the top with the Prime Minister, but there's a whole series of failures that need to be investigated. Why was it that our intelligence didn't pick up on this brutal attack before it happened? I mean, we pride ourselves in Israel on having excellent intelligence services. You know, we're very proud of our Mossad and the Shin Bet and so forth. And yet they took us by surprise. And that's, you know, Israelis are asking what happened. And then there's how did they cross the fence at so many points and succeed in just coming and raiding our communities? I mean, we spent a lot of money and technology. We were told many times that the fence is impassable, and yet they just stormed it and came across our side of the
one of the reasons, Mr. Regev, that people say the ball may have been dropped here in such a spectacular and deadly manner is because Prime Minister Netanyahu, for most of the year, has been fighting mass social protests and unrest over his attempt, as his critics put it, to usurp the authority of the Supreme Court, and that has distracted defence and intelligence operatives away from what they should have been doing, which is protecting the Israeli people from exactly the kind of attack that happened on October the 7th. And that for that reason, because it's all on Netanyahu's watch, and he's the one who's been waging this attack on the Supreme Court's authority and creating the social unrest, that because of that, he should take personal accountability and step aside.
So I think in many ways, I mean, we Israelis, as you know, have been having a very polarized political debate. We're very passionate about our politics in Israel, and there are people who hate the Prime Minister and there are people who love the Prime Minister. And our society has had this very, demonstrations against the government and demonstrations for the government and so forth. But maybe the brutal Hamas massacre on October 7th, that was to a certain extent a slap across the face. Because let's be frank, I know that part of southern Israel where they struck and they killed our people. But, I mean, frankly, they massacred our people, yes? They didn't ask us how we vote. They went into kibbutzim, which are on the left, yes, and they went into Sderot, which is politically, it's a Likud bastion. They don't care if you vote left or right, if you're secular or religious, if you're for or against the government's proposed judicial reforms. They killed us. They killed us randomly. They killed us brutally. They beheaded us. They raped They burnt people alive. You reported all this last night. I don't have to repeat the atrocities that were committed. And for Israelis who are passionate about their politics, and we like a good argument, but this is a wake-up call. And that is why you saw a major opposition party that has had nothing nice to say about the Prime Minister join the government for the duration of the conflict. This is a time for unity. This is a time to win. I mean, we didn't want this war. They declared it on us in their brutal attack. But now we have to win this war. And you've seen at the highest political level a major opposition party joining the government for the duration. And there will be a time when this is over. There'll be a time for politics. There'll be a time for lessons learned. After previous conflicts, we've had commissions of inquiries. We've had all sorts of investigations, parliamentary investigations, judicial investigations. I don't know what will happen this time. But it's, for me as an Israeli, it's very important that if there are lessons learned, that we learn those lessons. Yes, what happened on October 7th when they crossed the border the way they did, taking us by surprise, slaughtering our people, that's clearly something that needs to be examined very thoroughly.
When it comes to the moral line, what is your red line in terms of what Israel can do to get rid of Hamas? What would be too far for you? That's what people are asking right now. They understand that Israel is in a rage, that the people are shocked, they're in trauma. I've talked to Jewish friends of mine who feel genuinely fearful and traumatized by what has happened. There's no denying that. And the protests, the anti-Semitic nature of these protests since has been repellent and also adding to that fear. But what is the red line for Israel? I mean, is there a moral line that you won't cross here, or are all bets off when it comes to getting rid of Hamas?
First thing that needs to be said is that as much as people are angry, and rightly so, we haven't been shooting for the hip, and people have been talking about this ground invasion. What is it, for 2 weeks now, and it's still not happened? And so we are very thinking steps ahead. We're planning, we're preparing, and we'll go in. We're ready to go in. We're not acting out of rage. I mean, we're angry, but our behavior is judicious. And once again, we're looking not just what happens tomorrow, we're looking what happens next week and next month and next year. We're thinking this through very carefully, and that's important to be said. On the larger issue, look, when we send our soldiers into Gaza, we know they're going to be facing a formidable enemy, an enemy that's fighting, that's run the Gaza Strip for the last 16 years. They've got bunkers, they've got tunnels, they've got their defenses, and our young soldiers going into battle, I'm telling you openly, we know not all of them will come back alive. It'll be very fierce fighting. And then you raise the issue of the hostages. What will they do to the hostages in the framework of such a battle? And then there's avoiding, as best you can, civilian casualties. We've got all these issues. But having said that, I spoke to some of our young soldiers who are going into battle. And look, Israel understands that this just needs to be done. We have to do it. Look, we don't and refuse to live anymore next to this as a next-door neighbor. And as was said, Hamas is in many ways worse than ISIS. And I think if you ask me, what is our model, what is our red line? We watched very carefully what the West did, what England and the United States did in leading the fight against ISIS to destroy the territorial control they had in parts of Syria and Iraq. They had what they called the caliphate. They had territorial control. They were removed, and we will remove them the same way. Now, once again, in the fight against ISIS, there were innocent civilians in places like Mosul who were caught up in the crossfire, and that's not a good thing, but unfortunately that happens in war. And I think we will model ourselves on the same high standards as other Western armies. We'll fight our enemy ruthlessly and do our best in a complex combat situation to safeguard the civilian population as best as possible. But if some of the criticism is, well, you can't do this because there will inevitably be civilian casualties, no. That didn't apply in the fight against al-Qaeda. That didn't apply in the fight against ISIS. We will do our best to minimize casualties, but if someone says you can't destroy Hamas for fear of civilian casualties, that doesn't apply to any other country. It doesn't apply to Israel either.
Regev, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
My pleasure.